Hello. It's so wonderful to welcome you to another Love, Serve, Remember online gathering. I'm Jackie Dobrinska. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Director for the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation and your host for tonight. So part of my role is to help build community, to help us find connection and satsang. Um, and as many of you know, the Buddha said that the teacher, and of the teacher, the teachings, and the community, of the three, community is most important. And I think in part it's because our spiritual family helps us remember when we forget, and it's really easy to forget in these dense times. But I also think spiritual family is important because it builds this web of interconnectivity. And after all, we're all hungry for things and we all have things to give. And community is where those two meet. So we're in these mysterious times with social distancing in place and we can't meet in person. But we're creating these opportunities like events like these to come together. And so while we're virtual, I really invite you to take a moment and tune in to your body, tune into your belly, to your heart, your loving awareness, and then tune into the hundreds of other folks that are tuned in right now to this live stream event. And that we're all together. We're all coming together in spiritual family. Let's take a deep breath as we do that. Nice. And as we know, service is a key teaching of both Ram Dass and Maharaji. And understanding exactly how to serve is one of the great blessings in life. Yet, how do we find the practices and offerings that fully put that love into action? How do we evolve with life and continue to offer our unique gifts and dharma and loving service into the world? That's what we're here to explore tonight with the amazing Benjy Wertheimer. So if you don't know Benjy, I'm sure many of you do, Benjy's connection to Ram Dass in some ways predates his birth. His father was Richard Alpert's master's thesis advisor in the early 1950s. And some half a century later, Benjy joined Ram Dass and Krishna Das in Berkeley for a joint program in 2002. And since 2003, Benjy and his wife, Heather, have been providing music and kirtan for a lot of the pilgrimages and retreats in Maui. So Benjy is an award-winning musician, composer, vocalist, producer, and multi-instrumentalist. He started playing music around age 5 and has been studying Indian classical music for over 40 years, sitting with some really great masters of the tradition. He's toured internationally with his wife, Heather, in the kirtan group Shantala. He contributed as a composer and member of the Zikr Hussain Rhythm Experience. He's a founding member of the Hanuman and a member of the Confluence Trio with David, Michael, and Grammy winner Nancy Rummel. And he also has performed and recorded with all sorts of artists, Deva Premal and Miten, Jai Uttal, Walter Becker of Steely Dan, a virtuoso guitarist Michael Mondrell, and tabla master, Zakir Hussain, and also a renowned bamboo flute master, G.S. Sachdev. I think I said that right. He's produced 18 CDs since 2000 and has gotten airplay around the world. And his CD Circle of Fire went to #1 in the New Age radio charts. So that's a little bit about who we're talking with tonight. And we're going to be talking about dharmic shifts and how to put love into action. We'll be listening and enjoying some beautiful videos. And we're doing live Q&A. And so each of you, you're watching from different platforms. So as questions arise in you, starting now throughout the rest of the night, feel free to put them into the chat and they'll come to me. And as we have time throughout our discussion tonight, I'll bring them into the conversation as we can. So please feel free to ask your questions. So with that, let us welcome with our hearts and our hands, the amazing and lovely Benjy Wertheimer. Oh, you there? There he is. Yay.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So great to have you here. I wanted to ask real quick, what has your path been up until now as we start exploring our dharma and how we might most lovingly and effectively be of service in the world?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. It has been really quite a crazy quilt of experiences and paths over time. And as you mentioned in the introduction, some of it started with hopes that I would follow in my father's footsteps. My father's a psychology professor, and as you mentioned, he was Ram Dass's, then Richard Alpert's master's thesis advisor back at Wesleyan. But I guess it wasn't meant for me to become an academic, even though I know my father had hoped that I would follow in those footsteps. And in fact, after high school, I immediately decided that I was going to immerse myself in the sacred realm of North Indian classical music. It's a very special kind of yoga. They call it nada yoga or shabda yoga. And the whole idea is this attunement to the essential vibration of the universe that is at the heart of absolutely everything as the central focus of our music. It's not a diversion or an entertainment. It is absolutely a yogic practice. And I was joined by a lot of people that loved world music in the same ways that I did. And we started a band called Ancient Future. I guess I'm dating myself in saying this, which started back in 1978. Sometimes I say that dating yourself is simpler, but I won't go there for a minute. It's much simpler than trying to date, especially in the time of COVID. But Ancient Future was a band where we tried to bring together these different threads of different music traditions from Indonesia, from India, from West Africa, from the jazz and classical traditions of the West. And eventually that led me into a completely crazy new chapter where my ex-wife and I, for several years, were writing songs for a soap opera on NBC. I would never have predicted it in my wildest dreams, and yet there it was. And I suppose the biggest accomplishment as far as service in those years was I actually got this bowed instrument I play, the esraj, on daytime television in America. That was sort of my big contribution. At a certain point, I found myself being very disillusioned with the nature of the music business, and especially the Southern California version of the time. And I think it's sort of a cliche in our culture, just how dark that business can be sometimes, how competitive. And it was very, very hard for me. And when my ex-wife and I parted ways, to make a long story short, I completely shifted gears and got sucked into the American dream of the corporate life. I spent a number of years as a corporate software engineer and a systems analyst. And I started to engage in these deeply ego-focused practices that I think are at the hub of a lot of our culture. I was always looking for that next promotion, for status in my work. And every now and then I just would wake up feeling so hollow. And ultimately I recognized in pursuing this promotions, which I often got, that there was just nothing there but more money and more status in this world that felt like a thin veneer. So I left that world, and for a few years, I was a senior systems development consultant for the states of Oregon and Washington. I would consult with people who were doing things like drinking water quality assessment or the senior and disabled services computer systems, and help them to redevelop some of their systems. And that started to speak to something in me that touched me very deeply. There was something where I felt like when my work really mattered to someone else, and it wasn't just about making money for myself or getting status for myself, something was being awakened in me that very definitely got fully awakened when I was working with a number of Bosnian refugees here in the Portland, Oregon area. At first, I just met this one couple, absolutely fascinating. They were emblematic of hope for me because he was a Bosnian Muslim and his wife was a Serb. And they had perhaps the most beautiful 2-year-old boy I had ever seen in my life. And it gave me a symbol of hope. And I wound up eventually coordinating, getting a lot of different things that were needed to about 60 different refugee families around the Portland area, getting people from my then corporate job to donate couches they didn't need, dishes, all those kinds of things, and learned enough of the language to be maybe a little bit dangerous. I was kind of like a not terribly bright 3-year-old who was very focused on household items and employment. I am glad to say that during that time too, though, I was able to translate some documents some of the refugees had that helped them to get some work here in their new country as refugees. And then when I left that world altogether, a path opened up for me and for my beloved wife, Heather, in leading kirtan, devotional chanting, all over the world. And it was in that context that I first met Ram Dass, even though I had known of him for years. And in 2002, I was playing tabla for Krishna Das at a Berkeley event where Ram Dass and I finally met. It was an incredibly sweet meeting. And about a year after that, I was invited to be sort of the musical troublemaker at an event he was doing with Lama Tsultrim. And they were having these dharma dialogues between them. Started out for this whole weekend. The beginning of it was in a high school auditorium in Gunnison, Colorado. I think the capacity of the room was supposed to be 750 people, and they probably crammed 11 or 1,200 in there. And they had these beautiful talks, and they were prompted by questions to Ram Dass, and then I would occasionally play some music in between their talks. And at one point in that night, this was a huge thing for me that really set me on my current path. There was somebody in the audience who asked Ram Dass a question that I would summarize as saying, well, Ram Dass, it's great to talk about us being souls and all this love stuff, but I mean, what is it that we can really, really do day to day to put this into action in a way that actually matters and isn't just talk? And I know many of you who are familiar with Ram Dass would remember the way in which he would kind of go inside and let it percolate for a while. And I watched him do this, but instead of speaking to the audience, he gestured to me. It's like, you take this one. I was freaked. I was just beside myself. It's, like, dude, I'm just supposed to be the musician here. Help. You know, I was very scared, but something came through me, and I definitely attribute this to Maharaji. I said, just listen and say what comes through you. And I began to speak about the ways in which we could relate to each other as we looked into each other's eyes to recognize that place behind my eyes was reaching into that place behind the eyes of that person with whom I was connecting. And that was the starting point. And I can't remember everything I said, but I have to admit, I was very gratified. I got a standing ovation. And then I spent the rest of the weekend playing music for Ram Dass's retreat on Sultrim's land in Pagosa Springs. And at the end of that time, I went up to Ram Dass, and I was so humbled and so grateful for the opportunity to serve in this way. And I just came up to him and I said, oh, Ram Dass, I really hope you enjoyed what I had to offer. I'm so grateful for the chance to do this. And once again, for about a minute, he went quiet. Then he looked up at me and he said, you aren't sure if you're supposed to be a musician or some kind of spiritual teacher. I nodded. I guess. You need to be a spiritual teacher with your music. I had been coming through a period of my life where at about 5-year intervals, looking back, if somebody had told me 5 years ago I'd be doing what I'm doing now, I would have said they were nuts. Nothing really seemed to make sense. And yet, when he gave me that message, it was as if everything came together all at once. This is why the music has been a part of my life this way. This is why I was doing pop music for a while. This was why I had the opportunity to come into service with some of these Bosnian refugees who are the most inspiring people to me, perhaps in my entire life. And so the Dharmic shift that I went through from that point, somebody who was maybe helping a lot of people with computer systems, and I was maybe pretty good at it, but I never would have been great because my heart wasn't there, was suddenly called into service with music and with the practice of kirtan, and with using whatever gifts I could bring to honor something much bigger than myself. That was a huge Dharmic shift for me. And of course, Ram Dass is a great exemplar of what we're calling a Dharmic shift. He came from a very powerful and wealthy, influential family. And then he became a Harvard professor. And with that sort of corner office Harvard professor world, he was able to shift the entire paradigm of reality and consciousness that we understood as a culture for generations. Then when he introduced Maharaji to the West and he came into contact with that energy, he became really a beacon for the power of seva, selfless service in the world. I think it was really beautifully elucidated in his book, How Can I Help? And then another dharmic shift after the stroke. As he put it, the theme went from how can I help to how can you help me? Truly a gift beyond measure, especially for those who seek to serve in this world in the mode of Hanuman.
Great. All right. Wow, thank you for that. I'm curious if there's some others who may have inspired you on this inquiry, others who might have been guides for you along this way.
There were indeed a number of others, and I think I would start first with a man who is truly a hero of mine. And I think in these times and in many difficult times, we search for heroes, people who inspire us to move beyond our own immediate needs into a deeper level of service. And this was a man by the name of Vedran Smailovic. He was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera at the time that the horrible ethnic and civil war broke out. And I think it's a lot like what we've sometimes seen happen here, but worse yet, where essentially overnight, people who had been coworkers and colleagues and friends became mortal enemies literally overnight because of their ethnic background or religious affiliation or their ethnicity. It's almost unimaginable. And like many of us would probably do, he would wake up each day just hoping that it was all a bad dream that would go away. And it was not to be. And in fact, one day as he looked on, there was an artillery round that came down on a bakery where a number of people were just waiting in line to get some food. And it decimated the group there horribly. 22 people were killed and over 100 others were injured. At that moment, he was pushed over what I felt was a very sacred edge, in that he decided that for each day, or for 22 days, one for each person who had been killed, he would go out into the square with his cello and play. And this was happening while mortar rounds were falling randomly, while gun battles were raging in the streets. It's really an incredible thing. And in so doing, he had a dharmic shift from being essentially an entertainer to somebody who became an iconic figure, somebody who was yelling out about the craziness of wielding violence on each other, on what was going on in the horrible ethnic cleansing of the time. Reminding us that so often in human history, we seem to think that when we run short on resources or we disagree on religious or political principles, or for that matter, we want to inhabit land that someone else is living on, that there's some kind of answer in taking up arms against each other. Certainly it was that way in Bosnia. Many of the Bosnian Serbs who were behind the ethnic cleansing that was going on in Sarajevo, where Vedran Smailovic lived, were invoking the Battle of Kosovo all the way back in 1389 as a rationale for killing their neighbors and friends. It was a time in which it would be considered an act of kindness if you were one of the militias that was going through to tell your neighbors that they had to leave that night because the next day you and a bunch of others were going to come in and kill everybody they could. That was an act of kindness. It's so hard to see these things. And all of it, I think, came about because people thought they had the answers in this horrific violence, rather than examining the questions that led into it. So in a moment here, I'd like to offer a song that I wrote that began in Portland when I first met a homeless man on the street. And I saw him picking up cans in the rain while I was walking around on my lunch break from my gig as a software engineer and systems analyst. And I was feeling pretty damn smug. I says, wow, that poor guy, he doesn't know what he's missing. He doesn't have this great job that I have or this great life that I have. He's out here picking up cans in the rain. And he turned and he looked at me, and the look in his eyes was something I saw many, many years later in a man who was very hunched over in Kenchidam, and the ashram in India where Neem Karoli Baba spent most of his time, whose whole life was focused on cleaning that temple. And I've never seen a happier look on maybe anyone's face than that man in the temple. And I saw it years earlier. This man knew something I didn't know, that my own attachment to material wealth and success was a hindrance to my recognizing my own true nature in the deepest possible way that I could live in this world. So the invitation of this song and the video that we're going to be watching at the deepest level is to examine the questions that guide our lives, our perspectives, and our actions before we think that we have the answers.
Shatter on the asphalt as he bends to pick up one more can. Looking back again, his soaked and tattered clothes make me feel pity, pity for this man. If I knew the answers with my house, my car, my American dreams. Look in his eyes tells me he's on to something he knows, so much more than it seems. What was the question again? Just when I thought I knew the answers, what was the question again? It's the most important question of them all. Staya pitanya, hero moye, staya pitanya, pitamu, staya pitanya, molimo Bože, staya pitanya, pitamu.
So that song is entitled, What Was the Question? Along the lines of what we were discussing before, that so often we maybe aren't examining the questions well enough. And certainly a lot of the soldiers in Sarajevo were acting on answers before they had really examined the questions. And a part of the chorus, the second time the chorus comes around, it is in the Bosnian language. Šta je pitanje? It literally means, what is the question in Bosnian. Hero moje is my hero. That's hero is the same word in both languages. Šta je pitanje? What was the question? Pitamo, we ask. Šta je pitanje? Molimo Bože. What is the question? We pray to God. Šta je pitanje? Pitamo. What is the question? We ask. Raising our hands up to God in the question. And of course, the question is, what can we do? Especially now. This question is very present with us in these times. What can we do? It's really hard to see what's going on in the world, isn't it? So how can we reach out in love? How is it that we might reinvent ways we can support each other when the most loving thing we can do is not actually be in each other's physical presence? Because that's the way the virus gets around. We recognize that. We reach out in love. I hug you from here virtually because I can't do it in person. And were I to do so in person, it might not be a risk for either of us. That's the crazy thing, of course, about this virus. We might both be fine, but my father, who's still doing very well at 93, is perhaps the most vulnerable imaginable population. And those people downstream from us are people we need to keep in our minds and hearts. That too is a dharmic shift.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if this is a great time to post some questions, if you have any that are coming up to the people out there watching. And it is, that's the question, what is ours to do right now? And I think one of the things that's beautiful about what you're bringing is that can come through in so many forms. I often think about, we get this idea that it has to be this grand, big thing make a difference, to have that dharmic shift. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's the small things. You talked about the hero a little bit, and this idea that this idea of heroes is really interesting to me, that that there's one person out there that does it, and when often there's a whole group of people that working together. And sometimes it's the person, my part of it might be making flyers, but that is
Mhm.
potentially my service, and that's part of what we're doing. One of the questions that someone's asked is your relationship to the Quakers. Yeah, in fact, I just listened to Ram Dass talk about the Quaker pledge in an old lecture. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the question. Yeah, it came into my life from the very earliest times. In fact, one of my earliest memories was when I was 3 years old. I was born and raised in Boulder, Colorado. And at the time I was 3, there was not yet a formal meeting house, Quaker meeting house in Boulder. So my father actually held Quaker meetings in our living room. And my father, I love my father more than I could ever say in words. And he's an incredible man. He is somebody who is entirely beholden to the worldview, and I dare say maybe even the religion of science. He doesn't like it when I call it a religion, because to him, empiricism is, the way to do things, objective observation. And I have incredible reverence for empiricism in all its forms. It's something we really need in these times, maybe more than ever in my lifetime, as we're facing some of the problems we have. But it's only one way of looking at things. And my father, to make a long story short, escaped the Nazis at 6 years old. My grandfather was actually a very famous psychologist, Max Wertheimer, who is credited with founding Gestalt theory in psychology. And unfortunately, as a Jewish academic, he was at the very top of the hit list of the Nazis back in 1933. And they had to leave with what few possessions they could put together in about 72 hours, leaving Berlin to go to Prague, where my grandfather was born. And they stayed there for, I think, about 6 months before they realized that things were not going to get better. And fortunately, my grandfather had a post waiting for him at the new school in New York as a professor, because he had such a reputation. And so they made their way there at 6 years old. But my father lost his childhood. And not to mention, 2 of his aunts died in the camps. And even more tragically, another aunt and her husband killed themselves rather than allowing themselves to be taken by the Nazis. So his trauma was not as deep as some people who had been there longer, but it was a very real part of his background. Being a classic overachiever, he went into college at age 16, and he went to Swarthmore College, which is a Quaker school. And when he encountered the Quakers there, it spoke to something in him that he maybe didn't even know was possible. I mean, their focus on the most sincere form of worship being service in the world, the way that they had a social impact that was way outsized for the number of people that were actually Quakers. If you think of the Underground Railroad, for example, or all kinds of social action that has occurred since. And they didn't tell him what he had to believe because, well, as I love to tease my father, I love to call him an orthodox agnostic. By any of the methods he trusts, there's no way to prove or disprove God, and therefore he's not really going to waste his time with the inquiry in a sense. And, I understand that, even though we have the same reverence, as it turns out, for what I see as maybe the best argument there is for God, which is the fact of existence itself, the fact that any of this is here at all. So we can even have this discussion, and we agree there. So anyway, he was very connected to the Quakers, and I too became very focused on the Quakers, and especially their focus on nonviolence in my teens. And the way of experiencing Quaker meeting, I used to jokingly call it meditation for extroverts because you're doing it in a group. Love the opportunity to wait on the light. And sometimes as people feel moved by the light, they will speak something that comes from the inner light, as the Quakers call it, from that of God, which resides in each and every one of us. So I appreciate that question very much.
And it feels really appropriate as well, because if I understand right, part of it is to listen to the still small voice inside. And to have a dharmic shift, it means turning away from all those voices out there, all the things we've been taught, the conditioning, and turning to that still small voice and listening and acting on it. So it feels a really important part of this conversation we're having today as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I thought I'd also mention that my wife and I had a Quaker wedding, which is wonderful because you're actually married by a group. Even though the clerk of the meeting shows up, we were surrounded by our friends in a silent meditation at our union, which went so profoundly deep. And then as people felt moved, most of them were musicians, they would stand up from the group and sing a song to us or something. It was a very sweet experience.
Wow. And that sense of the community that each one of us holds a part and a piece.
Yes.
That's brilliant.
Yes.
That's brilliant. So this is sort of backtracking to the video that several people have asked about, is how did they do the throat singing?
Well, this also goes back to another phase of my life I didn't really talk about. In my efforts to meet my father's dreams to become an academic, I decided to, I studied Indian classical music very intensely for about 11 years. But at one point, I felt, no, I really need to become some kind of a scholar and academic. So I dropped my focus entirely on just performance of music and went to the University of Washington with a double major in comparative religion and ethnomusicology. Just the kind of thing that'll get you a job as a barista at Starbucks one day. So, but I was fascinated, of course, by both. But over the course of that year, I found that I kept encountering people who used to be good musicians who now just wrote about it and talked about it and analyzed it. And I knew I really wanted to engage with the music. But one of the great gifts of that time was that in the archives that were in the basement of the music building at the University of Washington, they had the broadest archive of recordings of music from around the world that existed at that time. And I used to spend hours just listening to all kinds of stuff. And I heard this recording of something called a Mongolian shepherd. And I thought it was interesting because this guy was singing with kind of an odd tone color to his voice. And then there was this flute playing over the top, except it was just him. And when I resumed my Indian classical music studies, I was fortunate to have a roommate who had studied throat singing and taught me some of the fundamentals so that you can actually sing two or more notes at the same time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I met a choir on a boat in Sweden once of throat singers. It's my first experience.
Oh, there are many people doing it at once. It's an absolutely magical effect.
Yeah, yeah. Another question that has come through is, do you have any tips for staying calm when you're talking to people who have different opinions of you, from you? Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because depending on whether it's from me.
Right, that's an important word there.
Yeah. For me, it always goes back to what's called the prayer of St. Francis. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. If I can get to a place where I find a point of commonality with this person, or I can even reflect back to them that I understand their viewpoint, then we have a basis from which we can start a real conversation. And it comes out of this mutual respect and, as Ram Dass would put it, this recognition of the soul in each one of us, that we are standing on a par with each other. And I'm not better than he is because I'm more educated or I have a more liberal viewpoint, or, you know, again, for conservatives, some people, back in the days I was working in the software world, one of my favorite lunch buddies was a very conservative guy. And we used to love to just joust. We'd get into this political jousting over lunch, but it was mutually respectful. And, you know, he came up with some zingers, like he said, you know, well, a liberal is just a conservative who hasn't been mugged yet, or, you know, things like that. It was, you know, but what's cool was that there was a playfulness about it that came out of our mutual respect. So it didn't have to be this serious thing or something to go to the mat for. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That we can, and that is actually perhaps the thing I most mourn in these times, and certainly going back for the last 4 years or so, is the loss of reasoned and respectful discourse between disagreeing parties.
Yeah.
Learning to disagree amicably is an art. It's one of the highest callings that we can have. And I love disagreement. I love to misquote Socrates in saying that the unexamined belief is not worth having.
Mm.
If somebody comes up with a different viewpoint than my own, it's an invitation for me to once again look into my own viewpoint. Sometimes I think what it comes down to is, if we look at our stance on almost anything, say, well, why do you believe this? Well, I believe this because of that, and I because that because of this, and this because of this other thing. And eventually you come down to something that I would describe as axiomatic. You can't prove it.
Mm.
It's a matter of faith.
Mm.
For me, if I call myself a liberal, which I do, a huge part of what that means is I have this assumption, this faith, this axiom that we have a sacred trust to take care of each other. And that wants to drive my political decisions and the way that I lead my life and the kind of respect I afford other people and the way in which I might give up something for myself so that someone else might be able to live a decent life. And that the only thing, again, as part of this belief that really matters is how much I can love and how much I can give. At the end of it all, nothing else really matters in anything like the same way.
Well said. John asks another question. To become proficient and skilled at something like music, it often requires a lot of practice and therefore a lot of time. And how do you view this in light of being of service?
It's a really excellent question, because sometimes engaging in a practice might seem like a kind of self-absorption or self-obsession, right? Oh, I want to make myself better at X, Y, or Z. What it really comes down to for me is that we're blessed to have a very specific set of gifts, each and every of us. And it's up to us to determine which ones we really try to cultivate so that we can realize our fullest expression and our greatest service by digging really deep into how we can maximize the way that these gifts flow through us. And for a musician, of course, a lot of that is, scales and practice of all different kinds. I feel very, very grateful that I had inspirations in my own life. I would specifically mention Ali Akbar Khan and Zakir Hussain, my musical gurus, who, to be able to sit with them was literally like being able to sit at the feet of a Bach or a Mozart or a Beethoven. Mm-hmm. They were musical geniuses of our time that are unparalleled, just exquisite, and they were so inspiring. And when I recognized that maybe I had proclivities that would allow me to play at a decent level, I felt like I was looking up at them at the top of this very high mountain from this little hill. But at least what I learned from them allowed me to appreciate what they were offering, and they too were looking up at something beyond themselves. Mm-hmm. As miraculous as their skills were, somebody who's kind of become a friend online, Katya Grineva, is a concert pianist who told me that she got to see one of my favorite pianists, Vladimir Horowitz, at his last concert in Moscow. And then afterwards, she was just so filled with awe that it was no problem to practice 10 hours a day to try to realize the same things that she had heard. Now, is that self-obsessive? Is that? No. That's the thing, is that this is how we can serve, because you can make music at that level. It's going to erase these false boundaries that we make between ourselves. It's going to erase this illusion of how we're separate from each other and invite us into our common human experience in ways that very few other things can. So it's an interesting thing to look at. For someone else, it may be something as seemingly simple as this wonderful man I told you about in Kenchi. He just kept the floor spotless so everyone could see the gleaming of the stone. They could walk up to Maharaji's statue and see everything in this exquisite cleanliness up in these beautiful mountains. And that was his gift. Many people probably never even knew he was the one behind it. And that too was part of it, that it was truly a selfless giving.
Yeah. It reminds me of the idea of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. like dharma being the purpose and artha being the means, one needs to fulfill that purpose. So scales, practicing your scales might be your artha, right? The come of the pleasure of doing it and the moksha of the freedom from doing it.
Absolutely.
So let's see. We all have these various influences that come into our life. They say when you're ready, the teacher finds you. And that over time, there's so many different influences that come in and shift us, and often are those dharmic shifts. And so I'm curious if you can give us another example of someone who's moved into a life of deeper and more powerful service of this like dharmic shift.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, one of my current heroes is the author and teacher, Stephen Cope, who's written some wonderful books about yoga. One of them is entitled The Great Work of Your Life. And I have to admit, it was very transformational for me in understanding the dharmic shifts in my own life by examining the shifts that had occurred in the lives of some very famous people, and then some people who were not so famous that he knew well, and how parallel they were, that those shifts, even in the lives of ordinary people, are extremely significant. But one person who really stood out for me is one of my favorite poets, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, I don't know how, probably most of you, of course, have heard of him, but when he released Leaves of Grass, I believe that was in 1855. It was a huge sensation. It was an immensely popular book. And also it was extremely controversial because it contained a lot of pretty open sensuality that was not part of the culture of the time at all. And yet, of course, it really put him on the map as a poet, as an author. And he was really just sort of at the peak of this wave of his career when we went into the Civil War, which is arguably the most contentious period in this nation's history. Unfortunately, with some parallels that we feel happening right now, that have the roots back into that time. And in that unprecedented time of division in our country, Whitman found himself being moved from perhaps the most celebrated, or one of the most celebrated writers of his day, to what he called a soldier's missionary. And what did that mean? Being a soldier's missionary, what it meant to him was that he would spend countless hours at the bedsides of thousands of wounded Union soldiers as a volunteer nurse. One of the greatest writers of his time, arguably one of the most popular, and yet he knew he could only provide a certain kind of comfort to people who needed it most by taking on this new mantle, by assuming a different dharma. Stephen Cope put it really beautifully in his book, and I'll quote here. Whitman's poetic genius could not be for himself alone. His deeper gifts reveal themselves when put in the service of the times and of the greatest need. Having been put in the service of humanity, his gift was ennobled, transformed. His words helped turn the dark wound of the Civil War into a kind of transcendent light. It's so true. And as it turned out, he was able to flip yet again after the war. Having served in the way that he did, he once again returned to writing poetry and newspaper articles and essays that were very, very healing now to the country at large that was recovering from the trauma of the Civil War. And he did that in a way that he simply couldn't have done if he hadn't shifted into that true calling of the time as a volunteer nurse. And around the end of the war, he melded these two different worlds, these two different paths, in a way that I find truly transcendent. And I'd like to also share a part of this poem. The title of the poem was How Solemn as One by One. In this poem, I feel the reflections, and I'm sure you'll hear them, of what Ram Dass was teaching us about the nature of the soul. I see behind each mask that wonder, a kindred soul. Oh, the bullet could never kill what you really are, dear friend, nor the bayonet stab what you really are, the soul. Yourself I see, great as any, good as the best, waiting, secure, and content, which the bullet could never kill, nor the bayonet stab, oh friend.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Yes, that's sweet. It's really a powerful, powerful poem. And
Yeah.
I think it invites us into this contemplation. How can we listen to our own inner voices in such a way to be open to a similar dharmic shift in our own lives, and also not to underestimate the potential impact of that for each and every one of us, because each and every one of us has a set of gifts and proclivities that are totally unique to us, that when we align with them in the right way and listen to the necessity for the dharmic shift, we can serve at our highest.
I love how you say gifts in the, when you use your gifts, or he said, when you use your gifts in the service of humanity. And it reminds me of a Meister Eckhart quote, which is, God calls us where your great gladness and the world's deep hunger meet.
Mm.
And I feel like that's what we're being asked right now, and that our great gladness shows up in 1,000 different ways for each one of us. And if we bring that to the service of humanity, like, that's the dharmic shift that needs to happen in a lot of ways for us individually and maybe collectively.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Yes.
Yeah. But it begs this, so there's this question of service, right? So listening to the still small voice, following it, bringing service into the world. I'm going to sort of expand on someone's question, which is, there's also some people who've been trained to that they have to give, like, in order to be loved, you have to give. Right. And so sometimes we can come to service and sort of neglect ourselves in some ways, or become overly dependent on others. And so I'm just wanting, and there's like a struggle to find peace in that. So I'm curious if you could speak into that a little bit.
Well, part of the setup for this scenario in your question is the way that we tend to view love in our culture, which is quite transactional. Mm-hmm. If I give you this, will you give me that?
Yeah.
And I think we step into that place of service if we look even into one of the very central things that we find in the Bhagavad Gita, where, among other things, we might want to bring something that's out there into the world. We can own our actions as it is put there, but we will never own the fruits of our actions. When we have an investment in or an agenda about the outcome of it, and especially, of course, if that's, hey, I do this for you, you give me this back, then we're asking for trouble. Yeah. And we are actually taking it from something that is transcendent and totally connected to the essence of love itself. We're taking it from that transcendent realm back into a very transactional, almost economic mold. And that's really kind of a tragic transformation from something that can be very, very beautiful. And when we can give something or do something without an attachment to the outcome, that it's that much more potent. And when I go back, for example, to the time I was working with Bosnian refugees, I have to admit there was a part of my ego that liked getting stroked about how noble this cause was. But as I spent more and more time in that world, what I recognized is that I was getting so much more than I gave, so much more. If I could go to bed at night knowing that I maybe made it a little bit easier for somebody's kid to have a decent dinner, or that they might even have a bed to sleep on in the first place, that mattered a whole lot more than any kind of ennobling attribute I would give to myself, or for that matter, anything I would expect to get back from these people in return. It was in the giving that the gift, and we've heard it said in many, many different ways. And the invitation now, I think, is as strong as ever. It's so important that we give everything we can, because I think it is part of the way the cosmos works. When we give from our hearts in the fullest, we will receive far more than we can imagine. And this is also the central lesson of Hanuman.
Mm-hmm. As you say that, there's two things that come up from that I want to share. One is that Marshall Rosenberg talks about giving as if a small child, as a small child feeds a duck, like saying yes when it feels like a small child, like you feel like you're a small child feeding a duck, like that joy of giving. And the other part that comes up is recognizing that self-care is an important piece of being able to serve. How does that land with you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole realm of essentially what I call healing the healer that is absolutely critical. That we can't serve at our highest if we're not taking care of ourselves, at least at a basic, fundamental, bottom of the hierarchy of needs level. We really need to take care of ourselves so that we can go up that hierarchy of needs toward the self-realization that comes about when we give of ourselves without the need for return.
Yeah.
But we also need certain things, there's no doubt, and self-care is central to that, yes.
Another, I don't know who this is from, but someone asks, you speak of these dharmic shifts as one would speak of gifts and grace. What if the gift is slow to come? What might be a wise way to conduct oneself when how one can best serve is not at all clear?
Well, first, let me express my admiration for the question, because it's a very deep contemplation. And in fact, there are times in our lives where we might act too quickly in what we think is service, and it may not be. But one thing that comes to my mind is actually going back a while to the earthquake in Nepal, where a lot of very noble-minded people sent a lot of money and a lot of help over there. And at a certain point, when it was in a critical phase, and this is kind of a short-term versus long-term thing as well, during that critical phase, it was important to have as many people as possible there to just start rebuilding the infrastructure that had been destroyed by the quake. But following that time, sometimes it was necessary to ask the question, once we've gotten past the critical phase, isn't it better to help support the local economy by allowing the local workers to do the work and receive compensation for it than for a bunch of volunteers to take that work away from them? So there are, it's a very interesting balance to keep in mind. And with that same idea in mind, I'd say that when we're confused about a larger dharmic shift, I think it can be very helpful to maybe narrow the focus a little bit to something very simple. Like, wow, I don't really know how I can serve the world best, but how about if I let this guy in front of me in traffic? And each of those things, I think, will help to start to inform things inside us that might guide us to a larger solution to the question that we're seeking and where I can serve the best. And in these little steps, we can't really, it's hard for us to overestimate the possible impact. Maybe that person's having a real bad day and an act of kindness will take them out of a terrible state that they were in. Or saying something really kind to somebody, not knowing what battles they were facing on the inside. Some of these seemingly small things can be so huge. So in the interim, before we have this big aha moment about our new dharma, be kind, be loving in whatever small ways you can. That would be my advice. And have faith. Give yourself time to contemplate.
Yes, so well said. The faith piece. Like, I think what comes up for people is there's this doubt of like, of this conditioning of like, what is my purpose? Do I have a purpose? Like, is it enough, that enoughness? And it's sort of can get in the way of it coming through. And again, some of the conditioning that thinks that it has to be this great big thing that I'm going to save the world, when often it can just be these small pieces that get us there. So I'm so appreciate that. I wanted to shift just a little bit. So one of the things that I found in my own life, and I think many people find, is that there's like anger or grief can be a huge point where a shift can occur. And right now there's a lot of anger in the world. There's a lot of grief in the world. And against this sort of backdrop, I'm curious, where do you think we might want to look for the energy and tools for inspiration and evolution and transformation?
Wow. Yeah, a little lighthearted question there. Huh?
Keeping it light tonight.
I mean, it's pretty rare these days that I don't find myself not pissed off for a while. It's, there are many things in the ways that we're treating each other that feel egregious, that definitely get my hackles up. And I think I'll start by saying that one of the keys there is to recognize that when we have that kind of anger coming up and the intensity of it, it's sort of part of what we like to call the reptilian brain. And we react from a certain place that does not allow us to, well, let's say in neurological terms, engage the prefrontal cortex, or in terms of compassion, to actually take that interstitial moment and not just react in anger, but to respond with thoughtfulness, with compassion, and maybe some of the tools that can be made available to us for the transformation of that anger. And though we don't often realize it, a lot of the emotions that we dismiss or avoid altogether because we consider them negative will often contain these hidden gifts. And it's, especially I think the gifts we really need right now of initiating transformation or evolution. And I mean, some of the things that come to mind in that regard, first of all, absolutely anger. And one of my other heroes, unlikely as it might seem, was, I think, characterized as a feminist author and clinical psychologist back in the 1980s, Harriet Lerner. I devoured her book, The Dance of Anger, back in the 1990s. I found it fascinating, even though it was theoretically targeted almost exclusively to a female audience. And it had to do, I think, with a subjugation of women in our culture that often would bring about very, very understandable anger. And we also see it in other cases in racism. We see it in many different ways, in all kinds of injustice. And I have to say for myself, there's no greater trigger for anger than injustice. When I see injustice, my immediate response is anger. But I'd also submit that what she sees there is the potential for it to be a catalyst. And that even though maybe initially she was talking about it from the standpoint really of primarily individual or couples psychotherapy, the time's arrived for us to expand that kind of vision to all beloved souls of any gender and outside of just our individual evolution into a broader transformation of our entire society, our entire culture. The deep uncertainty of these times, I think, can really open a portal into that process because first and foremost, I think anger is a signal, and it's one that is really worth listening to. It exists for a reason, and it does always deserve our respect and attention. Now, I don't know about you, but maybe a lot of you watching, and maybe you too, Jackie, in the family culture I was raised in, the taboos against feeling and expressing anger were so powerful that even knowing when I was angry wasn't a simple matter at all. And I didn't cultivate any tools to understand what I was angry about. I imagine that's mirroring a lot of your experiences out there. But what Lerner pointed out that really spoke to me is, if feeling angry signals a problem, that's a good thing. You're aware of the problem. But unfortunately, we'll have a tendency from there just to vent the anger. And venting anger alone doesn't solve the problem. And in fact, I often find that just venting the anger will tend to serve to maintain or even rigidify the old rules and patterns in a relationship or a system or a society or a culture, and actually kind of ensure that the change we wish does not occur. The invitation here is actually, I think, to use the anger as a starting point to change patterns, to start inquiries rather than to attack or blame people, to make them wrong. And the onus is on us, though, to tune into what the true source of our anger is. That's not easy a lot of the time. And from there, of course, to clarify where we stand. Because once we can clarify where we stand and what the goal is, we can start a discussion. And from there, I think we can begin the process of identifying consciously crafted courses of action that might address the sources of our anger in productive ways, not in blaming ways, in ways that make somebody else wrong or evil or awful. Otherwise, I think it just becomes a matter of diving headlong into polarizing conflict, which we're seeing so much of right now, with no clear agenda or any kind of a plan of positive, constructive action. Let me think, as Harriet Lerner said, it is amazing how frequently we march off to battle without knowing what the war is all about.
Oof.
So there's our challenge there. How do we take those things as a catalyst into making change? And another emotion that I find is often shoved into the background, especially in our culture, is grief. Absolutely. And so many of us are experiencing profound grief and sadness. So many things are lost. Many of us are mourning the old normal. Wow, why can't it just be the way it used to be? Many of us are also recognizing that the old normal was not sustainable. I know that you and I talked about this earlier. I mean, both of us have another hero in Martin Prechtel, who has talked a great deal about grief, and his book and topical area of grief and praise is just extraordinary. And he reminds us that the kind of agonizing grieving that we feel when we lose a loved one, it's an exquisite and perfect reflection of the love that we had for that soul that we can now no longer experience in the physical realm. Or it may be also for a circumstance that we've lost, but we loved it so much. And we recognize that love. We can use this. It's a path of recognition of that love, the transformation that comes out of it. And then eventually, what's so cool about it, this is going back to the earlier question about practice and so on, is that we might then be able to take this pain of loss and this immersion in an ocean of sadness and grief and transform it into a work of art or a writing or a piece of music that invites each soul who imbibes it into an erasure of this illusion of our separateness. There's an incredible clan of people who have experienced crushing grief, and we're part of that family. And grief can also usher us into this nourishing realm of tears, this realm of tears that I see as watering the realm of our hearts and our shared human experience, these parched lands of sadness, yet they are watered by these tears in our common human experience as souls. And I can't think of any sweeter gift in the world than music that makes me cry. It's so sweet. Or for that matter, the added gift when we're sharing it with someone else, and you look into their eyes and you see this other sweet soul who's just crying with you and affirming our absolute and unconditional oneness without the need for any words or any of these limiting concepts that we're so used to. It's very sweet. And, I feel as a musician extremely blessed to be able to dive into my own practice of that kind of transformation. And maybe this would be a good time to share another video where there's a beautiful raga known as Madhuvanti, meaning like honey. It's very sweet, where you can definitely feel a lot of this, the Greek sense of pathos, this real deep sadness. But it's an incredible thing. And another thing I love about it is, the Indian raga system is very, very ancient. Definitely in writing, even over 2,000 years of references to the Indian classical music tradition. But this raga actually came about during a very difficult period in Indian history and became to the foreground in the 1920s and 30s. Didn't really exist in the North before that time. So this is, let's just say that it's from my Esraj bow to your heart and from my heart to your heart. Madhuvanti.
Oh
So beautiful. Um, I have a question from Annapurna who asks, how do anger and grief intersect?
Wow.
Complex. Complex.
This little Venn diagram that comes in my mind, one of those places. And a lot of the time, I think it may have something to do with the source of grief being something to which we can point with anger, if that makes sense. And certainly there are very many valid reasons for having that juxtaposition, I think. If we look at racial inequity, for example, there's a lot of grief around the injustice that has occurred through generations of racial inequity, not to mention sex inequity, going back to Harriet Lerner's work, that I think warrants a response of anger. Absolutely. And that connection is a very, very real thing. What can be difficult about it, too, is that anger has the potential to become something that moves us toward a positive transformation if we're coming at it from an inquisitive standpoint where we ask, how is it I can use it in that way to really trigger a kind of change that's going to matter and address the source of my anger? I think that's a very important kind of thing. And altogether, unfortunately, if we get into a primal space around it, it turns to hate. Mm-hmm. And it's a fascinating thing because we often see love and hate as being these absolute opposites. Honestly, in my own view, and this is something that comes out of this question as well, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. If we're indifferent to the fate of our fellow humans or other beings that inhabit this planet with us, in one sense, you could say that's almost putting a hate into action because we are likely to perpetuate the kinds of things that keep them subjugated or suffering or in a mode of life that is anything but rewarding for them. And I think looking at the juxtaposition too, where they come together, it is an opportunity to clarify where you stand so that you might be able to look at what you can change about what is making you angry and what it is about the deep sadness that you feel that you might be able to take steps toward ameliorating it in a real way, not just shoving your emotions down. Or to, I mean, for me, so much of the civil rights movement was exactly that juxtaposition being put into action in our country when you had these people who were protesting. Now, I am somebody, of course, here's where the Quakers come back into it as well. I cannot and will not support violent action to foment change. I cannot. Because I believe that when we go into a violent response, we are immediately descending to that lowest common denominator that always is going to end in tragedy and violence. More violence and more violence and cycles of revenge and all of the baser qualities that we're all too familiar with. So that intersection can be a very, very potent place where we realize both of them are there. It can become the basis for major social change. And for me also, when I say I want to protest intensely, I want to take serious action, to stand non-violently in the face of potential harm is, to me, actually a much more courageous act than standing there with a weapon. That we stand there facing potential harm. And I mean, Gandhi did this so beautifully when he was protesting the British monopoly on the production of salt, that he just had a critical mass of people that no matter how nasty the British became and how many people were knocked down, more people who were not fighting back would keep showing up and make it super clear that what they were doing was absolutely and fundamentally and forever wrong. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the massacre at Amritsar. When all of these people were brutally murdered for no reason, the nonviolent response that Gandhi was advocating for so strongly was exactly, I think, the tipping point that made the British seem so off base in the way they were dealing with the Indians that it eventually led to the independence of India. That nonviolent response.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question. It's a good
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so much to say on grief and anger.
gosh.
It's such a deep topic. And as you're talking about it, as we've been sort of talking about it, this idea of tapas comes through. This idea of like how grief and anger can be a clarifying force when we're willing to sit with and feel it and listen to it. Instead of often we just want to discharge it, right? But when we let it be like that clean anger or that clean grief, I think, again, like coming back to our topic, it can create those awarenesses in ourselves of what matters to us, what we really value, what is not helpful in us, and create shifts in our lives in really positive ways. So,
absolutely. And to go a little even further into this, also, someone who comes to mind in this inquiry is the great teacher Catherine Ingram. And one of my favorite quotes from her is, "Peace is being with what is." We have this grief, we have this anger. We don't shove it down to be at peace. We don't have peace just being the absence of conflict, but actually being fully present with it in the best way that we can. And that is certainly the tapas you're talking about. That is not easy. We have all kinds of ways we want to numb ourselves out, or to engage with the anger in unproductive ways, or to become completely paralyzed by the grief. Yeah.
And that can get us into a whole topic of the overwhelm of oppression, but we'll not go down there today. So one of the questions that is important is, where can we find your music?
Well, it's on pretty much all of the online streaming platforms, Pandora and Spotify. If you go to my website, shantalamusic.com, you can listen to all of the selections of my music and also the music that I do with my beloved Heather, the kirtan that we lead. And, I have 18 albums of my own music that I put out there, and also the material that we did with the Hanuman, which is this wonderful ecumenical group. I just love these brothers that have been part of the group. And for quite a while, Genevieve Harrison, this incredible artist from the UK, was part of that as well. And I'm hoping to reconnect with her. But in the Hanuman, if you look for Hanuman, but the plural Hanumen, then you'll find this work. And these guys that I work with are all just brilliant artists in their own right. And we're all very different. We're on very different spiritual paths. And what we want to do is model something that we don't see very much these days in our culture, which is men who are completely focused on making their creative offerings to something much larger than themselves, completely out of a place of devotion. I mean, we're just guys. We're guys doing our thing, but it comes across, I think, that we're offering it up to something much, much higher than our individual selves. And so I definitely encourage you to check out the Hanuman, look around for that. And please visit shantalamusic.com. You can hear a lot of samples of our music there and download music directly as well.
Yeah. And that's that great message, coming back to our theme of how do you put love into action? How do you make the Dharmic shift? And it's this service of something greater. And then keeping that in our mind. I know that when I wake up in the morning, that's often like, how can I serve today? And sometimes it's through a meeting and figuring out how to do Zoom conference calls, So we're coming to the end of our time. There's some more questions, and I'm sorry I didn't get to those. I want to make a couple of announcements, but I also want to hear a little bit more about there's some more historical figures that help us show up more consciously and efficiently and effectively in these times. So I'm asking you that question, but I'm going to pause you first and just make a couple of announcements for the people that are watching, so that that you can watch or rewatch this live stream, as well as many others that we've had recently, and also be notified of upcoming ones. And we have a lot of exciting ones coming up at ramdas.org/livestream. We have an exciting music series starting soon, so make sure you check that out. I also want people to know that the Be Here Now Network kicks off its annual fundraiser on July 8th, which is Wednesday at 8 p.m. And it's going to be featuring a live mind-rolling podcast with Raghu Marcus, Duncan Trussell, and Natasha Leggero, I think is how you say her name. And also just to invite people to support the Love, Serve, Remember Foundation so we can continue to these live streams and the mission of continuing and supporting the teachings of Ram Dass and Neem Karoli Baba. And you can go to donate at ramdas.org/support. And I also want to say a big thank you because there's a lot of people that help make this happen. We have JR and Mangala on the background with technology, and Rachel and Kelly and Corey who all help sort of get the word out. So big thank you to everyone who helps put these on. And also, this is a fellowship sponsored event. So the Ram Dass Fellowship is a way to start to plug into fellowships, not only online and nationally, but through local satsangs. And so if you're interested in getting connected to local satsangs, check out the ramdas.org/fellowship page. So those are just a couple announcements I wanted to make. And now I'll come back to that question, which is some other people who really inspire you to show up consciously.
Thank you. Well, there are many, many examples, but I think the one that really comes forward the most right now is somebody who represents the kinds of changes that we're being invited to make in a period of transformation and challenge that's certainly unlike any I remember in my life. I don't know about you, Jackie, but
yeah,
I can't say I've ever been through anything quite like 2020 before. And a lot of my friends have been sharing with me that, yeah, maybe 2020 wasn't just such a great idea. Things that are kind of,
who knows? It might have been the best idea ever. We just don't know what is on the other side yet.
It is, yeah, exactly so. Because we had, I think, a mindset about normalcy and about a way of living that, whether we recognized it or not, had to change and will still have to change. And in certain cases, there are assumptions we have about the nature of reality or about what's going on in the world that we hold on to forever. And one man who I think is probably the best example I've ever encountered of this phenomenon is somebody whose name may not be familiar to many of you. His name was Hiroo Onoda. And he was a soldier in the Japanese army. And to make a long and really fascinating story short, Hiroo Onoda was part of a small group of Japanese soldiers that were left on the remote Philippine island known as Lubang way back in late 1944. And they had been left with the orders to defend their position at all costs by the major who commanded their regiment. There were just a few of them, I think maybe a dozen that were there at the time. The major said, it may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. But defend this position. Well, over time, a number of Hiroo Onoda's brothers in arms were captured, killed, or actually died in the jungles there. And the last known soldier was there till 1959, 15 years after the end of the war. But then suddenly, in 1974, the Philippine authorities started to receive these reports of a Japanese soldier who had been threatening and apparently even attacking local villagers in a very remote region of the island. It turned out that Hiroo Onoda had been following these orders for 30 years, living in the jungles. And there was a Japanese student and explorer, his name was Norio Suzuki, who heard about this. And he asked if he would be allowed to go up to Hiroo Onoda and ask him to surrender. And so he approached the known position where he was with the traditional white flag. They had been raining leaflets over the area saying the war was over in Japanese for years. But Onoda, of course, did not believe them because he had not heard from his commander. Okay. But he heard somebody yelling to him in Japanese under a white flag. And he recognized, okay, this is a wartime protocol I can respond to, right? And so Suzuki came up to him and asked him to surrender. And Onoda refused. said, I won't do so unless my commander comes back here to rescind the orders I was given. What was amazing about it was that Suzuki was so focused that he went back to Tokyo and found his former commander from 30 years before, who had now become a bookseller in Tokyo. Okay. And he was able to arrange with the Japanese and Philippine governments to get him out to the island. So he brought Major Taniguchi, this major, back to Hiroo Onoda. And when he returned to Lubang, he went up to Onoda. He said, the war is over and you can leave your post. When Onoda heard this, he sharply saluted, and then he wept uncontrollably for a long time. He also went into a formal surrender to the then president, Ferdinand Marcos, who, because he had been acting under these orders, actually granted him a full pardon, even though he had killed a number of people. Now, what a story. He went to transform his life, Hiroo Onoda. He only died in 2014, quite recently. And in 1984, he started what he called the Onoda Outdoor School, where he would teach Japanese kids to survive in the wild. And he became a very beloved figure, and he went back to deliver flowers to these memorials to those killed in the war in the Philippines. Very touching, very moving. Really coming back and really taking responsibility for what he had done and recognizing how hard it was. And I guess what it really comes down to is the central metaphor and lesson that's embodied in this tale of what I call, and many others have called, the loyal soldier. It invites each one of us to ask what might be a very painful question, very important in these times. What kinds of defensive tactics or orders do I tenaciously cling to when they don't serve me anymore, or those close to me, even though they probably did serve me very well in a different time, place, or circumstance? And when we explore this question fully and step into, I'll call them surrendering behaviors and patterns that clearly don't serve us anymore, we open to the possibility of a powerful transformation into a new life, especially the place we find ourselves today. And Onoda's story invites us to look for how we might identify and lovingly discharge in ourselves our own internal loyal soldiers whose orders are no longer applicable to the circumstances of our lives. I guess I just kind of close this by saying that Japan had a very deep response to the entire war, in that the culture after World War II had these communal rituals in place that clearly recognized that most of the returning soldiers were utterly unprepared to rejoin civilian society. We find that here in soldiers from all times, of course. And in these particular rituals, Father Richard Rohr is a wonderful ecumenical teacher who wrote about these. He wrote that they publicly thanked and praised effusively each soldier for his service to the people. After this was done at great length, an elder would stand and announce with authority something to this effect: the war is now over. The community needs you to let go of what has served you and served us well up to now. The community now needs you to return as a man, a citizen, and something beyond a soldier. And so I want to invite each of us into an analogous process of discharging our own loyal soldiers. Because I think when we surrender our outmoded defensive tactics and orders, we afford ourselves the opportunity to serve at our highest potential in a different way, and to give ourselves and all those around us what I think is our most precious and truly timeless gift, which is being fully in the present moment, and the gift of our attention and intention coupled together.
Such a powerful story.
Isn't it?
Such a powerful story. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And really, thank you. I've really enjoyed the talk, as many people are, and this invitation to ask questions, to really start to begin this inquiry in our own selves about what sort of shifts we might need to really fulfill our dharma and see a world that we want to see.
Absolutely. Well, and I think if we don't go into that level of inquiry, to kind of use a military analogy for a moment, it's a little bit like saying, ready, fire, aim.
You're right.
You know, especially as a Quaker, it's a little silly for me to say something like that. The whole idea is that I think we really need to take the time for at least the interstitial moment or longer to map out what is a conscious, compassionate, and likely effective response rather than being in a reactive place.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really hard, but that's what we're called to do.
It is. That's what these times are calling us to, for sure. That inner work.
Absolutely.
Did you want to end with a video?
Sure. I guess I'd like to offer one more video. I'll say first a little something about the video and then a little bit about other things it represents for me. I was really blessed to be joined in this video by my friend Jamie Sieber, who is just an extraordinary cellist, and 2 Grammy-winning woodwind players, Steve Gorn and Nancy Rumble. And what happened was I had this inspiration for a song that's based upon a tantric text that dates back to the 14th century that invites us into a recognition of our innate and divine nature. And since we couldn't actually get together and play the music in real time, I invited them each to shoot video of themselves, each of us having our own studios, to record our parts, and that I would stitch them together into a video and into a song here in my studio where I am today. And it just, to me, became this beacon of hope and possibility and connection at a time when we can't physically be together. And I hope it speaks to people in that way. And finally, as the central message of this text, you know, I found, and you probably have too, that many times when people are talking in these broad brushstroke terms about what we like to call Eastern spirituality, if we want to get really broad and general about it, we kind of have this equation, ego equals bad. The ego is a bad thing, particularly true if it leads to pride or arrogance. But I think, as Ram Dass and many others have pointed out, there are ways in which we actually need an ego to navigate this material, relativistic world we all share. But maybe more to the point of this discussion and what the video is about is having an appropriate awareness of and an appreciation of our gifts, because it's a critical part of enabling ourselves to serve in the highest way we can. If we don't know what gifts we have, how can we leverage them to be of greater service? If we can't appreciate them in ourselves, then how is it that we can learn to share them in loving ways with other people who might benefit from those gifts? I think the only real danger that comes out of that awareness of and confidence in our gifts is when we mistake ourselves for being the source of those gifts rather than some kind of a channel or conduit for them. And so this chant is a celebration of our innate divine nature and the blessing of being embodied right now so that we can serve in this time. And also an acknowledgement of the unique gifts that each and every one of us here right now has to share as we navigate the daunting challenges of this time together. So I hope you enjoy the music, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored.
Oh, it's been such a joy, and we're honored to have you. And thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight and being a part of this conversation. Look forward to it the next time as well. Amen.
Ashokapak Satchidananda Rupoham Nitya Mukta Svabhavam Shivoham 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 Shivoham. Shivoham, 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 Shivoham. She